Hello and welcome to Pixel Driven, a YouTube channel all about learning Unreal Engine, specifically for automotive rendering. I'll be presenting these videos from the perspective of someone coming from a production background in Maya, and make an effort to draw parallels between the two programs. In part 4 of this video series, we'll take a look at how lighting works in Unreal Engine. We'll take a look at what all the different light types are, how Unreal cameras work, and then we'll set up a product visualization shot using 3-point lighting. So we're going to start here by coming in and making a new level. And we'll call this Light Demo Geometry. Save this. We'll come in here and then we're just going to create the same type of stage that we've been making up until now. So we'll make a ground plane. We'll make this pretty broad. And then we're going to go in and find our mesh that we have been using before, so the material sphere, and we'll bring this into our level. And then we'll turn this towards the front, so set -90 on Z, and we'll save this. So that is our geometry level for this. So next we're going to make another level and call this Light Demo Lighting. And we'll make another level and call this Light Demo Main. Okay, so we'll go into Main, and in our Levels menu here, we'll add those two levels that we just made. So we'll go into Levels, Light Demo Geometry, and Light Demo Lighting. We'll select both of these and say Change Streaming Method to Always Loaded. And then we'll go to our persistent level to make that the active level. So we've got some geometry. We've currently got our main level set to active. And in this main level, we're going to create a camera to look through. So a couple ways to create cameras and a couple types of cameras in Unreal Engine. So from the Place Actors panel here, the one that we use most commonly is going to be under Cinematic, Cine Camera Actor. So this is the high quality camera system in Unreal. This is what you would use for cinematics in a video game. It's got all kinds of real world DSLR camera attributes on it, and we can get some really nice looking shots with this. Just to make you aware of what the other one is, so under All Classes, we scroll down, there is Camera Actor. So this is the basic camera system in Unreal. This is what you would use for gameplay in a game for like a first-person view or a third-person view. There's fewer controls on this, fewer film attributes that you can play around with. So we typically don't use these for automotive and product viz. We're going to stick with the Cine Camera Actor. So we'll make one of these, and with it selected in the scene here, you can see that we get a little preview window of what it can see. So we can turn this around. It's not really going to see anything because this is always going to be in lit mode, and currently there's no light in our scene. So we'll just kind of approximate where this is for now. And then over in our levels menu here, I'm going to double click the lighting level because I want this to be the active one. And we'll create our first light for this demo. So the first one we're going to show is the directional light. So we'll add our directional light, reset this to the origin, and then just kind of pull this up. And then I want to see through this camera. So up in the perspective menu, we've got Place Cameras, Cine Camera Actor. And it's a good idea when you start working with cameras to give these cameras names. So in my outliner, I'll find my Cine Camera Actor, and I'm going to rename this to Render Cam, just to make it really obvious what this is meant to be used for. So now that we have a light in our scene, we can see a preview when we have that camera selected, and we can get this blocked in into something that looks good. So we want to see what the different light types are doing. We want to give ourselves a little bit of room to play with. So something like that will work nicely. So from our perspective menu here, we can click on Render Cam, to look through that camera, and then Alt-4 to enter lit mode. So we can see that eye adaptation effect there when we started looking through this camera. So we want to turn that off. So we're going to go under Visual Effects and add a post-process volume. So under Transform, we'll reset this to the origin, just stick this off to the side, and then we'll make sure that Infinite Extent Unbound is turned on. Turn this on. And I wanted to point out something about attributes here in the Details panel in Unreal. There is a way to favorite these, the ones that you use very often, like this one. I'm pretty much turning this on every single time I use it. You can right-click an attribute in here and say Add to Favorites. This is actually already part of my favorites. So we can show our favorites with this little star icon here. So we turn those on, and I close my search. So up at the top here, I've got a favorites section, and Infinite Extent Unbound is sitting there, always pinned to the top of your Details panel. So I've got some of the things that I use really often here. So I've got metering mode, exposure compensation. I've got samples per pixel for path tracing in here, because I will change these pretty often, and infinite extent. So since we have them favorited here already, this is exactly what we need to use to turn off eye adaptation. So we'll turn the override for these two on, and we'll set our metering mode to manual. And then we'll take our exposure and we'll bump this up. So now we don't get any eye adaptation in our shot, and that's going to work nicely for us. So our directional light. So I want to pull this down somewhere that I can see it in this framing here. So remember, directional lights, these don't matter where they're placed in the scene. I can move this all around. It's not going to have any effect on the lighting at all. I can try to scale this. Nothing is going to happen. The only thing that really has an effect on a directional light is the rotation of the light. So as we take this and rotate it, you can see it acts like a sunlight. And so whichever direction we set this, this is going to change the direction that the sun is pointing from. So if we get this pointing almost straight down, we get this effect that's like noonday sun, right? And so you can have all this, almost no shadows on your object when you do this. So it's great for doing directional lighting. It's where it gets its name from. So there's a few attributes on a directional light that are kind of interesting. So this intensity, you can see that this is measured in a unit called lux, right? It's a little bit different from other lights in Unreal. Most of the other light types in Unreal are going to be measured in lumens. So 1 lux is basically a way to say 1 lumen per meter squared. And this takes surface area into account. So how much light is going to affect a certain areas. And so the reason it's based in lux here, at least the reason that I'm aware of, is our physical sun in our solar system. You can measure the intensity of that light in lux, and the value of that in the real world is actually 120,000. So if we set this to 120,000, of course our scene looking through this camera is going to be extremely overexposed, right? So if you're interested, and I don't typically do this, but you could be very scientifically accurate with your lighting in Unreal using a directional light that really acts like our sun, right? So if we go over to our post-process volume, we can adjust these values to bring that exposure back down so that our scene is exposed properly. So if we set this to the default of 1, we're still very exposed. So we can try 0.5, 0.1. We have to go really, really low to bring this exposure down. And honestly, I can't really get low enough. We're at 1/1000th of 1 value here, so I'm going to set this back to 1. And instead, I'm going to select our camera and start looking at how the attributes of the Cine Camera interact with the exposure in our scene, right? So if you look through these settings, we've got current camera settings up at the top here, and you can see that we're currently at a focal length of 35 millimeters. Our aperture is 2.8, right? So 2.8 is a wide open aperture. It's letting in tons and tons of light. We can change the aperture of our camera to narrow it to something like a 5.6 or 8 or 16. And this is starting to look more correct, right? We're properly exposed at this point. So with a directional light that has the intensity of our sun, our physical sun, we can set our camera exposure properties and our aperture to let in the correct amount of light for a properly exposed still shot, right? So aperture, intensity, exposure compensation, these things can all work together to properly expose your shot. You know, so there's a lot of different ways to adjust the exposure of your scene, right? So what if, you know, you don't want to work with f16 because you're not going to get very much depth of field with that? Yeah, if maybe you really want to work with f2.8, right? Because you want that bokeh effect, you want depth of field in your shot, right? You're not going to be able to get that at such a narrow aperture. You got to widen that up. So on the camera, if you scroll down under post process, and then lens, and then camera, kind of hidden in here is the shutter speed of your camera, right? Which by default is 1/60th of a second. That's the way you read this attribute. It's 1 divided by this number, or 1 second divided by this number. So 1/60th of a second. So we can make this a faster shutter speed, you know, so 1/1000th of a second, or 1/2000th of a second. And you know, all of a sudden here we've got a properly exposed shot again. So if you want to use the real intensity of our sun, you want to use a physical lens that is a nice wide open aperture, this is how you're going to be able to get these different bokeh effects on your camera. So before we move on here, I'm going to undo that directional light setup that we did with the realistic sun values. I'm going to set this back to its default of 10. And then in my render cam, I'm going to adjust this back to its default. And I'm going to set my exposure compensation in the post-process volume here to be what drives the exposure of our scene. We set this to a value of about 10. We get pretty close to correct exposure here. And then with our render cam, let's talk about some other settings that we have here. So under the current camera settings, we see we've got film back. And so by default, it's 16:9 digital film, so your default 16:9. And if you open this, we can actually see the sensor width and height of our camera body here. So I tend to like to use 16:9 DSLR. It's a little bit larger of a sensor. This doesn't have too much of an effect on render quality or anything like that. It's just this is what I'm used to using. I've done a lot of pipeline development based off of this camera for Unreal, so I'll tend to use this for the 16:9. And then if we scroll down from this, we've got lens settings. There's a bunch of different stuff in here for animating, you know, different effects on our camera. If we wanted to animate the focal length or the f-stops of our camera, we can cap these off at a low value and a high value. So down to a 4mm and up to 1000 millimeters. I usually don't mess with any of these personally. And then under focus settings, this is one of the important ones. So we've got focus method, manual focus distance, and then this draw debug focus plane. So what these do is, you know, we need to be able to define at what point in our shot the depth of our shot is going to be in focus, right? So the default is for that to be manual, and the distance is 100,000 here. So if we set this all the way down to a value of like 2, we should see our whole scene go out of focus here. And with this draw debug focus plane, if we turn this on, we should see this purple overlay in our shot. And as we change the value of this to something like 300, 400, 500, you'll eventually see that focus plane cut into your shot, right? So if we say 600, 700, you'll eventually see it intersect the subject that you're shooting, right? So maybe it's a little bit too far, so 650. So now our focus plane is intersecting this kind of front part of our material sphere. So that's pretty close. So we know that our subject is just perfectly in focus at that point. And so we can affect depth of field with these settings. So our focus distance, as well as our focal length and aperture, these are all going to have a pretty dramatic effect on the depth of field of our shot. So we can see that in action if I make another copy of this and stick it way back into the background here. Maybe we'll make another one and throw it on this side. And if you're familiar with real world cameras, you'll know that the longer your lens and the wider your aperture, the more dramatic that depth of field effect is going to be, that bokeh effect. So I'll set my focal length to something like 100 millimeters, and I'll pull my camera back a bit here. And if we take our manual focus distance, instead of typing in this value and messing with the focus plane, if you've got a point that you want to be in focus, you can use this eyedropper button here and sample something in your scene, so like our logo, and we can make that in focus here. So we don't get much of a dramatic depth of field effect here, and the reason for that is the scale of our scene that we're working in right now. So this is kind of an important thing. We're talking about PBR rendering in any application, but we haven't really talked about the scale of this default stuff in Unreal yet, right? So like how big is this material sphere in the real world? Because we have a camera that's being based off of very real world attributes. It's going to have physics that interact with the scale of our scene, realistically, right? So if these things are all just like 1 foot by 1 foot, this is only a distance of like 5 feet, right? So that depth of field effect is probably not going to have that big of a difference between this one and these ones. So we can figure out what the scale of everything is just with a default cube, right? So if we go to Shapes, Cube, the default cube in Unreal is going to be 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, right? So if we look at this, we're only 15 or 20 cubes or meters away from our subject. So what's behind them here is really not going to be that far away. It's like a few meters behind it. And there are some measurement tools in Unreal. So for example, if we go to the top orthographic view here to look at our scene, if you middle mouse click in here, you get a measurement tool in these orthographic views. So we can say from the center of our object here to this is a distance of about 500. And when we do this, this is in centimeters, right? So 500 centimeters or 5 meters, okay? So we'll come back to perspective here. So a distance of 5 meters for the depth of field effect is really not that much. Realistically, these things need to be much farther away to be out of focus. So if we go back to our render cam now and pull these over, you can see they're definitely more out of focus now compared to where they were before. We have a crispy edge on this one. These ones are falling off quite a bit. Okay, so make our ground plane a little bit broader here. And we should see the edge of our ground plane gets a little bit soft here as well. So you can play around with depth of field. You get much more dramatic effects with depth of field the closer you are to something like this. And so if we want to focus really close on the edge of this and sample something like this here, we'll see our background get really out of focus, right? So if we're doing a macro shot of the car paint on something here, so for example, we throw our car paint on this object, and if we remember our scales, our flakes here, we can set our flake value to something much higher, like 15. That looks good. It's essentially doing a macro shot of our car paint. Everything that's in the background here is going to be out of focus. So you can start designing some really nice shots using this. If you want to do some nice artsy fartsy bokeh effects with your cameras, you could do all that stuff in Unreal Engine using these techniques. So that's a little bit about cameras and the way they interact with lighting, lens, aperture, exposure. You can do some really cool things with that stuff here. So I'm going to recenter up my camera, kind of get things oriented correctly again. And I'm going to set my lens back to a 35, and we'll look through that camera again. Make sure we get things nice and straightened out here. Okay, so I'm going to pull back on my camera. I'm going to delete that cube that we made. I'm going to delete these other meshes down in the background. And we'll pull our camera down a little bit here. So continuing on with different lighting setups, right? So we looked at our directional light and what that can do. So I'm going to set the visibility of this light off, and we'll start taking a look at the next light here. So under the place actors panel, we'll go to lights and we'll throw in a point light. We'll set this back to the origin here, and we'll get this pulled off to the side. So we can see a point light. It's essentially a single point in space that emits light in all directions. So the placement of this light is really important, right? It's going to dictate, the direction of that light, but it's just going to throw it in all directions all the time, right? So we pull out here a little bit. We can move this around our scene and see what we get. And it's got this nice soft fall off by default. And you can see this kind of a blue wireframe sphere around our light. This wireframe sphere around our light is going to be the attenuation radius of our light. So this is the distance at which this light will have any effect on our scene, right? So if I were to set the intensity of this really, really high, like 300, we would think, this would throw light like way out into our scene and light up everything like into infinity. But because this attenuation radius is set to 1,000 by default, this is 1,000 centimeters, away from the radius, I believe. And again, we can double check ourselves by looking through the top view. So with the value of 1,000, if we measure from one side to the other, so the radius of this is going to be 1,000 units. It's really 2,000 across. Go back to perspective. And so that attenuation radius, if we change this value, it's going to constrain how far that light can influence in our scene. And so if we set this up to a much larger value, this starts acting like a much broader light in our scene, right? So you can really use this effect to light different areas of your scene really selectively, right? So if you've got a light on like the interior of a car and you only want it to affect the passenger side seats, you can adjust this attenuation radius so that it doesn't go and light up everything else in the interior. So you can start being really selective with where you're actually getting light to hit and land. This is what attenuation is really useful for automotive rendering, at least. It does have a lot of concepts surrounding it that are really useful for game techniques. We're not going to dive into any of that stuff here, but just know you can use this to really control fall off of your light. And so going down the list here, we're actually going to throw our car paint back on our material sphere here so we can have a bit of a look at how these things react with the specular highlight of these lights. So if we look at this one, we move our light across. If you look at the top of our material sphere here, we'll see a specular highlight moving across our subject. And so what these other attributes do is they really affect the specular highlight of our light. And so for source radius, if we take this and increase this value to 10, 50, 100, we saw a couple of things happen here. So first off, our specular highlight reflects the size of that light, right? So we see a much broader specular highlight, but we also saw our shadow go much softer here. So this is a phenomenon in real world lighting where the size of your light and the distance of your light to what it's illuminating will have a direct impact on the sharpness of the shadow that it casts, right? So we'll set this back to its default of 0. We get a razor sharp shadow. We set it to 100. We get a nice soft shadow, right? So the broader your light, the softer the shadow that it will cast. And you can really use this to your advantage when you're lighting shots. If you want to use shadow as a storytelling device in your shot, you can absolutely customize how sharp or soft those are, right? So that's the source radius of a light here. Soft source radius is going to directly affect the shape and softness of your specular highlight. So if I take my soft source radius and increase the value of this to 10, 50, 100, we'll see that specular highlight gets much softer, right? So this isn't really necessarily a physically real thing, at least as far as I'm aware, but you can use this as an editing tool when you're setting up lighting. If you want to diffuse reflections on things, that's one possibility, right? I typically will leave this set to the default of 0 because this is more physically accurate. This is what I would kind of expect to see in a photography studio, is real highlights. So I wouldn't really mess with that, but just know that you have the option to. And the next thing here is source length. This is going to affect the size of our light here. So you saw with the source radius, we saw this yellow sphere kind of appear. This is the actual physical size of our light emitting object. So 100 centimeters, or with a radius of 100 centimeters. So our source length is going to elongate that, right? So by 0, it's just, 1 point in space. And we can elongate this with the source length. So if we take this and rotate it, we get this pill shape. So you see our specular reflection has this nice kind of a Kino light effect now. So if we make this really long and we pull our source radius down, this is how we would get Kino light effects, right? So if we set this length to 2000, we get this nice Kino effect. And these were all over the place in automotive lighting, a couple of decades ago. They're, used a little bit more sparingly now, but this is one of the standard tools in the toolbox for automotive lighting. Not so much today, but a lot of photographers who may see this, who remember doing this in person, you'll remember setting up Kino lights all over the place. So that's essentially a Kino light in Unreal. So we'll set this back to its default on both of these, just to have a single point in space, and that is our point light. There's quite a few more attributes in here that we can mess with. We'll get into more of these when we get into the rendering video, but these are the basics for point lights here in Unreal. So we'll set this light's visibility off as well, and we will create our next one. So under lights, the next one here is spotlight. And see, I get this warning just now that says actor placement warning. The actor will be placed outside of the bounds of the current level. Do you want to continue? I don't really know what this means, to be honest with you. It doesn't seem to have any effect on what I'm doing. I'm not sure what this comes from. If somebody wants to let me know in the comments, I would love to know. You can see it got created right here next to the origin, so I'm not really sure what it's talking about. If somebody could tell me, that would be awesome. So we've got a spotlight here. And if we pull out from our camera and raise this up a bit, we can see a spotlight is really just like a point light, but it emits light in just a fixed direction here, which is a cone shape. So if we bring up the intensity of this to 100, and we pull this down so that cone starts intersecting or enveloping our subject here, the cone is the attenuation radius of this light, right? So attenuation radius by 1000 by default here. If we increase this to 2000, it's going to be much larger and it'll reach a little bit further. So we've got a few attributes on a spotlight here. So inner cone angle, we'll leave that alone for now. We'll take a look at outer cone angle. So that's this outer cone here. This is going to be 44 degrees by default. So we can narrow this beam of light or make it broader. It's just like using a spotlight on a stage, right? And so the inner cone, this is going to create an inner cone in here that's going to tighten up that beam of light. So we look at the edges of it here with an inner cone value that's really close to the outer cone value. The edges of your light are pretty sharp. So it's like you're on a theater stage, you've got a spotlight on you. It's just very crisp beam of light that's hitting the stage, right? So I typically will leave the inner cone off or at a value of 0 because I like spotlights to have this nice soft fall off. I use spotlights really frequently for direct lighting on cars. All right, so we'll see this effect here. We'll bump up our intensity and jump into our camera view. When we start moving this around, you can see it doesn't create a ton of reflection on our object, right? Which is really nice for lighting cars. We want to be able to illuminate different areas of the car without having big, broad softbox reflections everywhere. This is kind of one of the key aspects to lighting a car, is putting spotlights into areas that you want to illuminate to show off the shape of the car. We'll take a look at how to do those reflections in the next light here, but with spotlights, you just know this is the direct lighting for a car shop. This is the primary direct lighting for a car shop. And so we jump out of our camera so we can see where that specular highlight is. You can see it kind of going around just the edge right here of our material sphere. It's a really small specular highlight that we get. And so source radius, this works just like a point light. So we can increase the size of that highlight and soften our shadows with this value here. And that is a give and take because, like I said a minute ago, one of the nice things about spotlights is that they have very little reflection. Now we're getting more reflection in our scene. Like we're blowing out this front section here. We got a really broad specular highlight. It's not always desirable, right? But we do get that nice soft shadow. So all of this stuff is really a game of give and take. Again, you need to balance the effects that you're getting in your shot with the type of light that you're using to get something that looks nice, right? So that's the source radius on a spotlight. I will typically leave it at a value of 0 unless I'm in a really specific situation where I need to have the spotlight create a soft shadow, right? And then soft source radius works exactly the same way as it does with a point light. If you increase soft source radius, it's going to soften that specular highlight. Source length, I don't really know why this is an attribute on a spotlight. So we'll see this here if we zoom out. So we've got our source here. If we increase the source length, it kind of does the same thing as it does on a point light. It'll elongate that specular highlight, but it has no impact on the direct light. So it's a little bit strange. This is very much a CG light. This isn't really physically possible in the real world whatsoever. So I tend to avoid this. It makes weird effects, but if you want a spotlight to be what makes an elongated reflection, specular highlight on your subject, you can do that. So one more thing to play with. So that is a spotlight. We'll turn that one off. And the last one that we want to talk about here is going to be the rectangle light. So we'll create one of these, set it to the origin, and we'll rotate this so that it is pointing down, right? It's not always clear what direction these things are pointed. I kind of wish that they had an arrow like the directional light does. One way you can tell really obviously is which side of it lights up your subject, right? So if we have it going the wrong direction, there's no light pointed towards our subject, we get light. So that's one way to tell. You can also tell with the barn doors of a rectangle light. So if you look at a rectangle light, it's got two outer squares here. The outermost one is going to be the barn doors of our rectangle light. And so if we take our barn door angle on this light and decrease this value, we're going to close those barn doors a bit. If we go really low, we're going to narrow the beam of light here. So the angle of them and the length of them is what's going to do that. So we made that angle really steep. Now if we make that length much longer, we get this effect of a square light. It's got like a square spotlight at that point. Remember our attenuation radius. We can't really get far enough away here, so we need to increase that. And now we can see what we get. So it kind of creates this square lighting effect here. So that's our barn doors. I will typically set these to, the barn door length. I like to set this to 0. I don't typically like using barn doors personally. And then I'll set the angle back to the default. So what that gets us is, just a single plane here with no barn doors. I'll know that this whole square is a light source, right? This is a light panel at this point, or a softbox. So we can take the source width and source height of a rectangle light to increase the size of it. So we can say maybe 1,000 by 1,000. And if you notice when we do that, it seemed like the light's intensity went way down. So this is one interesting thing about rectangle lights. If you take our source height and width and height here, set these to the default, there's a little bit more light in our scene. So make this really broad, everything goes really dim. And the reason for this is that this intensity attribute on a rectangle light is going to be spread out across this whole surface area. So this is a value of 8 spread across, 2000 by 2000 centimeters here. So basically like every square inch of this thing is emitting really dim light at that point. And so if you've got a big softbox like this in Unreal, you really need to crank up the intensity for it to have much of an effect. So something of this size, like 2000 by 2000, you're going to need to crank this value up to like 300 or 400. So 300, 400, and now we get a nice looking light effect on this. Maybe 300, 400 is a little too high. 300. So now we get a nice reflection across the top of our subject here. And, this is kind of a good point to start talking about how light works in Lumen, right? So we've seen all the different light types. We've kind of just been taking for granted, what's been happening this whole time. But the reason we're getting so many different effects is because Lumen does a lot of stuff automatically for us out of the box here. And so, we're getting this nice reflection across the top of our surface here. We know it's a car paint, it's very glossy, but we're getting a lot of reflection that's bouncing up from our ground plane here. And we're getting some GI that's bouncing into our sphere as well. This is a great time to talk about how light in Lumen really works. So what we're looking at right now is, this is Lumen's software ray tracing, right? So this is Lumen's hybrid approach to be able to do stuff at 60 frames per second here, without breaking a sweat. It's using a hybrid approach which combines ray tracing with rasterization, which is more of a game type of rendering, to give us these ray traced looking effects. But it's not fully hardware ray traced at this point, right? So if you know what to look for, there's a few really odd things about the way these reflections are working. And you can see this really clearly if we throw a new plane into this scene and set this down to the origin and bring this up a bit. So we can slide this into our shot here and start moving this around. We get some weird effects going on in our reflections in this thing. Like in our plane, in this reflection, we can see it's got this kind of secondary shadow going over it here. So this is the Lumen software ray tracing kind of just doing some weird stuff, right? So we can make this really broad. It's just not really an accurate reflection, right? If you didn't know to look for that, you may think, this looks fine. But when we're talking about car rendering, we'll see this really dramatically when we start seeing reflections in the side of our body panels and different areas of the car here. We want those reflection cards to show up accurately in our car because it's how we're going to be able to design the reflections on everything. So Lumen works with software ray tracing by default here. And if we come into our project settings, we can switch this over to hardware ray tracing. So if we search in our settings for ray trace, you can see use hardware ray tracing when available is turned off. So if we check this on, we immediately see a quality increase in our reflections. So I'll toggle this on and off if you want to keep your eye on the material sphere there. So off, on, off, on. So with it off, I kind of want you to focus right here on this thing. There's these really streaky looking reflections that come in. This is one of the most telltale Lumen software ray tracing artifacts that comes into renders all the time. And I've started to see this just about everywhere for people that are doing automotive renders in Unreal who maybe aren't that deeply into this yet, is these streaky reflections will be just all over the place. So if we turn hardware ray tracing on, those weird artifacts just go away. So if we create a plane again in here to see that effect, what we get now is a much more realistic reflection of that plane going across our object here. You know, it no longer has this weird double reflection effect. It's just more accurate, right? So if you want the highest quality reflections out of Lumen and you want to avoid using the path tracer, you really want to make sure that you're using hardware ray tracing whenever possible. You know, and we're talking about rendering still images and videos. We're not concerned with 60 frames per second. Again, you know, we can get the most that we can out of our GPU and turn all of these nice features on. So this is one that I would definitely recommend having on. So the next setting that we want to turn on in our project settings under ray tracing is going to be Raytraced Shadows. So this is turned off by default here. So we turn this on, we can see the look of our render changes a little bit again, right? So off, on, off, on. And it makes things just a little bit cleaner. So with Raytraced Shadows off, these are all just like simulated shadows at this point. You know, they're not really real physically accurate shadows. These are all rasterized shadows at that point. So we turn this on, everything just gets nice and clean. It's more realistic again. And it's just another checkbox that we need to have on pretty much all the time when we're working in product and automotive. So now our render is much cleaner, it's more accurate. And, you know, just as a little exercise here, you know, maybe we want to practice lighting a little bit with this and try making this look a little bit better. So if I was looking at this shot, I would think that this big broad reflection that's coming across our object here is a little bit weird. It's not very desirable looking. And so one thing we can do is start hiding reflections with a couple of techniques here in Unreal. So one of the ways that I like to do that is by creating light blocking planes. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to create another plane and grow this a little bit. And I'm going to bump this up on the Z by 0.1. And then I want to make a material that's going to make this plane really dark, right? So I can take one of my materials that we created last time. So maybe I'll duplicate this black plastic black. I'll make a duplicate of this. And we're going to call this MI Basic Light Blocker. And apply this to our new plane here. So if we open up this material, I want to take this F0 and just bring this down so we're not getting any specular light on this, right? So our color for this, I want to change the color of this until I like the value of where it shows up in our subject, right? So maybe not totally black because that is going to look a little bit strange. It's like it's very dark in here. So maybe something in this range looks nice. Say okay. Save that material. And then with this plane, I can adjust this to clean up our reflections. So maybe something like this, right? This is looking much softer. This looks much richer. But we get this weird line going across our screen. And maybe we don't want that, right? So there's a couple more attributes on static mesh actors that are really useful for doing things like this. And essentially it works just like primary visibility in Maya, right? So one of my favorite attributes for lighting in Maya, we like to throw stuff all over the place. We don't want those things to be visible to the camera, but we want them to have an effect on the lighting in our scene. So on a static mesh actor, there's a couple of settings in here for this. One of them is going to be the visibility attribute. So we need to make this object invisible, but we also need to tell this object that it needs to affect indirect lighting while it's invisible, right? So it's essentially the same thing as primary visibility, right? If you know how that works. So let's search for visible. and we'll turn this off. And then we need to search for effect. So we get effect indirect lighting while hidden. So we turn this on. And so you can see we get this weird noise when we do that. And so this is kind of a limitation of Lumen. Where this really becomes valuable is with path tracing, right? So this weird black noise that's coming in here, this is because this plane is casting shadows, and because we have effect indirect lighting while hidden, it's technically casting shadows onto the plane underneath it. And so we can try turning off cast shadows here. So we'll uncheck cast shadow. And it cleans it up, so our ground plane looks nice, but we don't quite get the effect that we were going for by cleaning up this reflection that's in here. So if we switch this over to the path tracer, it does have that effect, right? So we take our plane and we turn off effect indirect lighting while hidden. It gives us that effect that we were trying to do by toning down that reflection. But in Lumen, it doesn't quite work the way we want it. So Lumen definitely still has, some things that we need improved, for this type of rendering. Again, though, if you're going for the highest quality shot, you're probably going to be path tracing. So there's a bunch of tricks that you can do. That's just one of them. You can play around with different combinations of objects that have their essentially primary visibility turned off. So you can have invisible objects show up in reflections. You can have things affecting GI, shadows. You can mix and match these things to affect your scene in the way that you want it, right? And especially if you're doing path tracing, you'll have much more accurate effects when you use those attributes. So one more thing about these types of attributes here. If we select this plane, we'll go ahead and delete this for now. And then we're going to create another sphere in our scene. So we'll put this off to the side and just kind of stick it right here. So if we're path tracing, there's one more attribute on static mesh actors that's really useful, and that's called holdout. So if you come from Automotive and Maya with something like V-Ray or Redshift or Arnold, you've probably dealt with holdouts, especially if you've worked in the world of configurators, right? So what holdouts do, if we turn this on, this acts like a stencil now. So anywhere where this object is visible to the camera, it's going to make those pixels on the screen essentially 0 in all 4 channels. So RGB and alpha, right? So if we take this sphere and we move this around, like I said, anywhere where it's visible is going to make that part of the render just disappear and be totally gone. So for where it intersects something and the parts of it that become occluded to the camera, it's not going to have that effect. And so if you take this and stick it backwards in space, whatever's in front of that holdout object is still going to be visible. And the reason that this was so useful in Maya for car configurators is rendering out different parts of a car that you need to swap in a post tool like New, right? So you can start setting up those types of render passes here in Unreal with the path tracer. One caveat about this is it technically works in Lumen too, but not while you're using substrate materials, which is a total bummer. So basically, if we switch over to Lumen, we can see we have holdout turned on, but it doesn't do anything. And that's because we have substrate active in our project. This is something that I hope that they do enable when substrate goes to beta or production status. But just know if you want to utilize holdouts with Lumen in 5.4, you need to have substrate turned off, unfortunately. Okay, so that's holdouts. And so yeah, that is all of the basic light types in Unreal Engine 5 here. So we went over all of these here: directional, point, spot, rectangle, and we've seen HDRI backdrop in the last one. And HDRI backdrop actually includes a skylight. So we've sort of seen the skylight in action already. But basically the skylight in Unreal is a tool for generating outdoor lighting that captures the light in our scene and reprojects it back in to act as something to create GI, right? And so we can see what this does and why this is useful really quick here. If we take our Rect light here, we'll set this to invisible. So we've got no light in our scene. And there's a tool in Unreal that's really useful for setting up outdoor lighting. So if you go to the window menu and go to environment light mixer, this is a really simplified UI for creating outdoor lighting. And so these buttons across here, if you just go ahead and click each one of these, so we create a skylight, creates a skylight, create an atmospheric light, creates a directional light, create a sky atmosphere, creates a sky atmosphere, create volumetric cloud. We get clouds when this finishes compiling, so we'll let that do its thing for a second. So we've got clouds. And then create height fog, which kind of creates the effect of atmosphere in our render here. So now we can close this, and we've got outdoor lighting really, really quickly. And so the environment light mixer is just a nice little shortcut for getting all the necessary actors into your scene to do outdoor lighting. So we jump out of our camera and kind of see what we got here. We can see Unreal's sky system in effect here. So the really cool thing about this is if we take our directional light, we can change the rotation of this, and it dynamically affects everything in our scene. So those volumetric clouds actually have volume to them. They'll cast shadows. They're not 2D, they're actually volumes here. They have thickness and depth. And if we rotate our sun on this axis, it'll change the effect of the time of day and the temperature of the lighting, and we can get a sunset or nighttime effect with this as well. So if we go below the horizon, we're not properly exposed for that, but so it goes from like noonday sun to warm lighting to cool lighting all the way down to nighttime. Yeah. So when you've got these actors together in a scene, when they're created from the environment light mixer, all of these abilities are there, straight out of the gate. So it's a really nice way to block in sunlight really, really fast. And there's a few great videos on YouTube for making volumetric clouds look really nice. The ones that come in by default here, they're not the best looking. And, there's different profiles that you can assign. There's different ways to customize these to make them look really, really cool. So I'd definitely recommend looking into that. William Fauché has a great video on volumetric clouds here in Unreal. All right. So that is all of the light types that we deal with here in Unreal Engine. I'm going to go ahead and delete these ones that we just created. And we'll make our rect light visible again. So those are our light types. So there's a couple more concepts that I want to cover here about lighting and some utilities that we have for these in Unreal. The first of which I said that we would cover in one of the previous videos here. So we'll talk about light mobility here for a moment. So if we take our rect light here and we look at its attributes, its default is set to stationary. And so far we haven't seen any issues from this. It does everything that we need it to do. So what mobility is for, this is really a video game concept. Essentially, mobility is a limitation for video game lighting when you're doing baked lighting or built lighting for a video game. So built lighting is when you take all the lights in your scene that are set to static or stationary, and it bakes the effects that they have in your scene down to scene textures, right? So you basically don't have to calculate the light when you've done that. It's all pre-computed, which basically means like the shadows are stuck to where they are. If you move the light, the shadow won't move. Effects like that are just baked into textures. And so it makes these really complex scenes that maybe have lots of props and things that don't move. The lighting for them doesn't have to be calculated all the time. So it's really easy for the engine to display that stuff. It's very performant. And so what mobility, one of the limitations of mobility is if you have multiple overlapping lights like this, these two lights here started displaying these red X's here. And basically what that means is these lights are overlapping with too many other lights, and so they've been turned off or disabled from being calculated. And if we set all of these lights to movable, that limitation goes away, right? So now these are movable lights. They don't care how many overlapping lights there are. Again, this is just a video game concept. So for us doing automotive and product biz, we don't really need to care about this. Typically, we'll just set everything to movable so we don't run into any issues, right? We don't really care about rendering things at 60 frames per second. We just want things to look nice, right? So that is light mobility. The next thing I want to talk about here is lighting channels, right? So if you're familiar with light linking in Maya, and we want this light to affect only our subject, but not the ground plane, we can use lighting channels to achieve that. So if you take your light and you search for channel, we'll see lighting channels in here, which is set to channel 0 only by default. The way this works is lights have lighting channels and mesh actors have lighting channels. So you can see if I selected this material sphere here, it also has lighting channels, which is set to 0 only by default. If I turn off channel 0 on this, it's not going to receive any direct light from that light source. So this light source is only affecting channel 0. This object is not accepting light from channel 0, so it's not going to get anything. But you can see that it does still accept indirect light from any channel. So that's one thing to be aware of there. So if we want this object to accept light from channel 0, but our ground plane, we don't, we can turn that off, right? So now we get kind of this effect here. So if we turn this back on, you know, it's producing GI and everything into our subject. Maybe that's not quite what we'll go for here. So this is another way to control like what is affecting the GI and reflections in our scene. We can do that same trick with visibility and affect indirect lighting while hidden. We'll get the reflections of this thing in here, but not the direct visibility of it in our shot, right? So we turn these things back off. You can see it does some kind of weird stuff with our GI, right? So we turn visibility off, indirect lighting on. We get some GI, but we also get this weird cutout happening in our reflection. So again, with Lumen, kind of does some weird stuff. If we switch over to Path Tracer, it's what we would expect to see again. So no background, but we're getting the light influence of the background on our subject. So again, one more argument to use path tracing in Unreal. It gives you just the most realistic results and the closest results to what you would expect to see if you're used to doing this type of stuff in Maya. So that's lighting channels. So we'll save what we've got here. And the next thing that we want to talk about is setting up a example product visualization shot, right? So we'll actually do a 3-point lighting setup for a product. And there's a pretty cool asset that comes with the starter content in Unreal. And we can use that as our subject to light a product shot. So in our levels folder here, I'm going to create a new level, and we're going to call this product viz example. We'll save that and enter that level. It's totally blank right now. And for this example, we're just going to construct everything in this one level for simplicity. But just remember, you know, you can use level streaming to construct this like we did in all of our other ones. So we'll need a product to light for our product shot. So if we go to the all level here in our content browser and filter by static mesh, we'll see all of static meshes that are in the engine at this moment, right? So stuff that's in our content folder, stuff that's in starter content, stuff that's in engine, plugins, and we can scroll down on this to search for an asset to use to light, right? And there's one thing in here that's really fun. The HTC Vive controller here. So we can pull this into our scene. I'll go to unlit mode and I'll set this to the origin and kind of see what we get here. So this is, you know, a Vive VR headset controller. You know, it's a nice little model that they include. You know, we'll double click on the static mesh here so we can see a little preview of what we got. So you can see we've got this nice product here. It's a pretty decent model. This would be a great thing to use to show what 3-point lighting can do. So you see these kind of coral colored handles here. These are sockets in Unreal Engine. When We're not going to use these at all in any of these classes, but essentially for a prop like this, these sockets are how you would snap this prop to a character rig, right? So if you want the character to be able to hold this, you can attach these sockets to your character rig and have it realistically hold it, right? So a little fun fact about the way character rigging works in video games. This asset comes with sockets built in. So we'll close this, and we need to start getting some light set up in here and a background and orient this, create a camera. So we'll go ahead and start all that. So the first thing I want to do is take this and rotate it 90 degrees so that it's facing, straight up. I haven't covered these yet in this video, but these menus across the top here, these are snapping. So we can snap to a grid for move, we can snap to an angle increment for rotate, and we can snap to, a percentage for scaling. And so for our rotate tool, we're going to snap to every 10 degrees now. So we'll rotate this 90 degrees so that it's facing straight up and down. And we're going to create a new Cine Camera actor to look at through this. So I'm going to go generally to a front view on this, go to our hamburger menu and create a camera here, Cine Camera actor. This is an alternative way to create camera actors in Unreal instead of going through the Place Actors panel. You can kind of go to a view that you like and say create camera here. So Cine Camera actor. So now we can look through that camera. I'm going to rename this to render cam. And I just want to make sure that this camera is nice and centered up in our scene. I want to make sure that everything is centered here. So our subject here is going to be at 0, 0, 0. Our camera is at 0, 0, 0. And then we want to just pull our camera back on the x-axis so that we get it in frame here. And so there's a couple of view things in the viewport here when you're working on setting up cameras that are really useful. So if we go to our perspective menu here, you can see I'm currently in the cinematic viewport. It's very likely going to be in the default viewport typically. And so if we switch this over to the cinematic viewport, we get some additional tools in here that are really useful. For example, up on the top right here, we open up this menu, we can see composition overlays. So we can get a 3x3 grid, 2x2 grid, just a crosshair, rebatement. So I like using the grid just to show, making sure I'm very centered up on my subject. So I'll jump back into our camera. That's nice and centered. But where are the edges of my frame? I don't really know where the outside of a resolution gate is here. So I can turn on the action save and set this all the way up to 99%. And I get a really clear view of what my shot is now. So I can take my camera and I can take the location, lower this down until it's nice in the center of our shot and then zoom in on this. And so maybe we want this to be at like a little bit of a 3/4. We'll get this nice and centered, so I'll turn off snapping and get this nice and centered up in our shot. Something like that there. Looks good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a backdrop for this. So I'm going to make a plane. So I'll go to Shapes, Plane. I'll set this to the origin. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. I'm going to push this back behind our subject. And if I look through my camera, I just want to make sure that this fills our whole frame. So I'll take this scale and increase this until it's covering our whole frame. So you can see when I'm moving my scale here, all three of these values are moving together. It's because I have this little lock icon enabled. If you turn this off, you can independently move these sliders. So I'll take these and increase them until it covers our whole frame. So there is our backdrop. Okay. Now we can start throwing some lights in this scene. So if you're familiar with 3-point lighting, we've got a key light, a fill light, and a rim light. It's great for doing stuff like products because it just shows off so many nice little angles and the character of what we're shooting. And it's just really great for doing this type of a shot. So we can go into our place actors panel, lights, and I'm going to use rectangle lights primarily for this. So I'll create a rectangle light. I'll go to lit mode, and I'll set this to the origin here. I'm going to come out of my camera and see where we are here. So right now, our camera, our subject, our light by default, we can kind of see that this object is really tiny. And you know, that's fine, right? So we take our light, you can set the source width of this as something like 2 by 2, and I'm going to set my barn door length to 0. And we're going to move this light around so that it's pointing at our subject. Take a look through our camera. This is where we kind of need to start dialing in exposure for our shot. So that means we need to post-process volume. So visual effects, post-process volume. We'll make sure infinite extent is turned on, and then we'll come in under lens exposure, set our exposure to manual, and then we'll adjust our exposure compensation, something like 10, maybe 8, and then we'll adjust the value of our light here. So we'll try 2 or 1, and that's working pretty good here. So now we're out of focus on our shot. So we'll go to our camera, we'll take our eyedropper for focus distance, and we'll focus on our subject. So you can see sometimes when you use manual focus distance, like there, this is a great example of how this fails sometimes. It's actually not hitting this object, right? It's hitting something else in our scene that's beyond it. And so sometimes you need to come in and just tweak this by hand until it's intersecting where you want it to. I've had that happen to me occasionally. You know, it's interesting that it happened here so you guys can see that if you run into that issue. Typically, I'll just turn on the debug plane, manually adjust it, and we're good. So we'll take our key light here, and since I can't see it on screen, I'll use the sliders for the location on the transform settings, and I can adjust the placement of that light with those sliders here. So key light, you want to be the main light in your subject, which for me, I want to be this like nice 3/4 lighting from the top right here. And that's looking nice to me now. So the next thing is we'll take our light and duplicate it. So we'll hold Alt and drag a copy of this on. And I want this one to be our rim light for this. So we'll come back into lit mode, go to our camera, and we'll take this and move it around until we get a nice rim light effect. So for a rim light, I like to make this one a little bit more broad. Maybe we'll make this something like 16 by 16, maybe even larger than that. So 64 by 64. And we'll take that and move that generally behind our object there. So if we hide our first light, we can see the effect that we get from our rim light here. And the direction of your light here is going to have a pretty strong effect on how much of that rim is being shown. So we get it a little bit more behind our subject. We get some nice rim effect going on here. And since we made this light so large, we probably need to bump up the intensity of this. So I'll set that to 2. Bring back our key light. And for the sake of it here, we're going to start naming these lights as well. So we'll do key light and rim light. And so the last thing that we need is a fill light to bring in to kind of eliminate these shadows a bit, or to cancel out these shadows a bit. So we'll make another copy of this light. I'll take my rim light, duplicate this over, and get this spun around here. So we'll look through our camera again. It's very much overexposed at this point, so we'll take our intensity and set this way down, something like 0.4, 0.3, 0.2, and see what we get here. So I still feel like this is really strong. 0.1, maybe even 0.05. So that's nice. We get a little bit of illumination on these dark areas, but we preserve some of that lighting direction that we did with our key light. All right, so we'll call this fill light. And I'm going to take all three of these lights in our outliner here, and I'm going to right click and say move to create a new folder. So this creates a folder in the outliner, and we can call this 3-point lighting. Okay. So that's looking good. Now we need to light up our background. So we'll come out of our camera, go to unlit mode here, and we'll create another couple of rectangle lights for our background. So we'll bring these over, take a look at lit mode, and we'll get these moved around so that we have a nice light direction affecting our backdrop. Come into our camera, kind of see what effect we're getting. Maybe it's a little bright. It's a little bit too close to our background here, so we'll come out of here and pull this out a little bit. And then we're just going to make a copy of this and bring this down and rotate this up and over. So we get this nice gradient effect on our background. I'll hit G on my keyboard to hide the icons and kind of see what we've got so far. So this is looking pretty good. You know, I think from here we can play around with some stuff to kind of art direct our shot, like the temperature of the light. So we can change that. So we'll go into our 3-point lighting, go to our key light, and maybe we want this to be a little bit warm. All right, so we'll take the temperature of our light and pull this over and say OK. We'll take our rim light, take the light color and set this to be a little bit cool, as well as our fill light. We'll set this to be a little bit cool as well. So just a subtle light color effect that we've got going on here. And then for our background lights, first of all, we'll set these into their own folder. Say background lighting. And we'll set these to have a color as well. So we can crank this just to kind of see what kind of effects we can get. You know, maybe there's something cool that we can do with this. Maybe we'll make this just a little bit cool for now. I tend to like cool lighting in general, personally. That's just my taste. You know, you can do whatever you want with this. So one of the cool things about this controller mesh here, if we select this and look at the material that's assigned to it, if you open up this material, you see it's got a vector parameter here for trim glow color. So we can take this and set this to a color. So maybe we like this, you know, electric green color. Maybe that's cool. We'll save that. And now for our background lighting, maybe we want to complement that. You know, so we'll take our background lights. We'll take this light color and adjust this to be something a little bit ridiculous, like a bright green. You know, it's maybe that's not so good. You know, so let's play around with this, find something that works, maybe something complementary, or maybe we just leave it a little bit cool. All right. So we can take our camera, maybe we would just do some adjustment on our camera angle here. Do some fine tuning. You know, so since we're so close to our subject here, you know, if we pull out a little bit, our camera lens is only a few inches away from our subject here. Maybe we pull our camera back and we increase the focal length of our camera. So we're going to scroll down and look at our focal length. It's actually set to about a 12 millimeter here. So this happens a lot when you create cameras from this menu. It's going to be a very, very wide angle. So that's why we're kind of seeing some weird stuff as we look at this. It's really distorted. So maybe we try something like a 50 millimeter instead. Looking at our preview, just pull this back a bit, look through our camera, and we'll see if it lets us use focus distance here. So we'll try sampling that. Didn't work, unfortunately. So we'll get this pulled a little bit closer until we intersect our object. So maybe 100. And we'll turn off our focus plane. So that looks much nicer to me. We get a much flatter look on the object here. We can really see the shape of the top of this thing. It's just a much more presentable way to display this thing. So I like that a lot better. And that is our product viz shot. So super simple to get 3-point lighting set up here. You can really play around with angles, lensing, light color, light direction, and just really have fun with this. And this is all done with stuff that's built into the engine. So if you want to repeat this, you can absolutely do that. So let's take a look now at a few more details about path tracing here. So if I go into path tracing view mode here, and kind of go back and forth between path tracing and Lumen. This is one cool thing about Unreal 5.4 is that path tracing and Lumen, when it's set to hardware ray tracing, they're really quite similar. Path Tracer is a little bit more accurate, a little bit more realistic. One of the cool things about Path Tracer in here is you can see this little progress bar that's going and filling up slowly. We have a strong depth of field because of our camera settings, but we have a progress bar that's filling up here. So if we go up to our post-process volume and scroll way down on this towards the bottom, there's going to be a path tracing section here. And so path tracing in Unreal in the post-process volume has a bunch of its own settings in here. So max bounces, samples per pixel, max path exposure, whether you want to accept emissive materials or not. Reference depth of field is a nice one. I usually always turn this on, so it has a much more realistic depth of field. It's not a post-process effect at this point, it's a rendered effect. Reference atmosphere is for outdoor lighting. And then the last one here is the denoiser. So this progress bar, which we saw became crispy because we turned on reference depth of field. So it's a real depth of field effect now. It's not part of our interface. We can take this samples per pixel, and the reason this is filling up so slowly is because it's doing 2048 samples per pixel by default here. So we can set this to a much lower value, like 128, and our render will resolve really fast if we do that. So it'll get to the point where it has sampled 128 samples per pixel all the way across our image. When it meets that threshold, it'll denoise the image, right? So if we turn off the denoiser, you can see there's a little bit of grain in our render here. So we set this value to something like 256 and see how far that gets us with noise. There's a lot less noise in our image, but it's still there, right? So if we turn the denoiser on, it cleans it up really, really well. And so denoising in the Path Tracer is really effective for getting pretty fast renders done with the Path Tracer, but you just have to be wary of denoising in general, especially when you're doing animated shots. So if you have an animation sequence that you're denoising, that denoise pattern, depending on how you have it configured in the engine, is potentially going to cause swimming in the noise in your renders, right? So it might have this really kind of uncanny effect in your final rendered sequence. It's usually due to how it was denoised, right? So denoising in Unreal for the Path Tracer, built into the engine, there's two different denoisers. So if you're doing animation, I'd recommend setting the denoiser to the optics denoiser. I've had the best luck with that one personally in production. And so we'll cover that when we get to the rendering video in the series. That will be a render setting that we set up in our final render. So the next thing I want to show here is, also under the path tracing section, you can see there's a drop down at the bottom for lighting components. And so this is pretty new for Unreal. I think this was 5.3 where this was added, maybe 5.2. But if we turn all of these checkboxes on, we have the ability to subtract light passes from our render now. So I'm going to turn all of these off so we can see what they do individually. So if we turn on just emissive, we'll see our emissive materials. If we turn on just diffuse, we'll see direct diffuse light, diffuse and indirect diffuse. We'll see those together. So if we turn off diffuse, we'll see what our indirect diffuse is, which in this scene is not much, right? There's not a whole lot of light bouncing around in the scene because it's very self-contained. It's a subject and a backdrop, and that's it, right? If we turn on specular, we get the direct specular as well as indirect specular. So those two together, only the indirect, so like self-reflections on an object. And then volume and indirect volume, we don't have anything that's using volume lighting in here, so we're not going to see any effects with this. So this is one way that you can render AOVs out of Unreal, is using the light components in the path tracer. And there's a really specific way of setting this up in our final render that we can cover for the rendering class. But the one thing that you need to remember about Unreal with lighting components is that each one of these is going to be a re-render. So unlike V-Ray, Redshift, Arnold, you're not going to get these as separate passes in an EXR by rendering the image once. You essentially need to render your image for as many light passes as you want, right? Unreal doesn't currently support unpacking these things with one render, right? It's a huge disadvantage of light passes in Unreal. But you know what? I'll take it for now because at least we have something, you know. I would much rather have the ability to get light passes at all rather than rely only on a final pixel render alone, right? So just know that you have the ability to do this if you need to do that for your compositing stage. So that's lighting components. So to recap everything that we talked about in this video here, we went over what all of the different light types in Unreal were and how these interact with our scene, all the different attributes for all of these. We created a Cine Camera actor and showed how this interacts with exposure, lensing, aperture. We talked a lot more about post-process volumes in here. And then we set up this 3-point lighting product vis shot and showed a few more details about path tracing. So I hope you got a lot out of this video. Please let me know whatever questions you have, and I'll be happy to respond. But otherwise, we can look forward to learning about animation in our next part here. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you there. If you learned anything from this free video on YouTube here, please leave me a like and consider subscribing to the channel, and look forward for the next videos.